Kyūshū, October 1944. The bell in the Itazuke operations shack rang with the same bright insistence reserved for school recess and factory whistles, but its meaning was colder. Men moved not with excitement, but with the tight, silent urgency of men who had already seen too much of war. The duty officer slid the intercept strip across the table with a fingertip that trembled just slightly. Raid detected. Altitude 3 to 1,000. Heading southeast to northwest. Strength unknown. The men already knew the rumor. A new American giant, engines that glowed like welded steel in the sun, wings wide enough to cast a shadow over an entire village. The Boeing Superfortress B-29. Some called it impossible. Some called it propaganda. Today it had a shape, a bearing, and an altitude. At Ashiya, ground crewmen in stiff winter parkas ran along the flight line of Ki-44 Tojo fighters, tugging propellers through in the freezing air, clearing oil from radial cylinders. Mechanics shouted for caution, pilots shouted for speed. In the confusion, someone laughed not from humor, but from disbelief. 31,000 feet? That was not an altitude, it was another world. Men did not fight that high, eagles might. Engines coughed, backfired, settled into a high-pitched, whirring snarl. At Itazuke, the first J-2M Raiden of the 302nd Kokutai rolled down the strip, tail high, exhaust stacks flaming violet in the thin dawn. The aircraft leapt into the air as though dragged by a cord into the freezing sky. Oxygen masks snapped into place, gauges trembled. The climb began. The Kyūshū coast fell away in a watercolor wash fields, charcoal huts, river ribbons, silvered by morning frost. Within minutes the cockpit canopies fogged with the breath of men who breathed too fast, hearts running ahead of propellers. The world below shrank into a child's map. Above, only blue, paler and paler, until it threatened to vanish into nothing. The superchargers howled, not like machines but like animals straining against chains. Manifolds glowed cherry in the icy light, hands cramped on throttles. Eyes darted from oil temp to manifold pressure to fuel, again and again, as if repetition could quiet fear. At 27,000 feet, a Tojo shuddered violently, its engine coughing like a sick child. The pilot eased the nose forward, pleading in a whisper to the Nakajima engine, as though it could hear him through steel and frost. The shudder eased, but the aircraft no longer climbed. The world was suddenly small cockpit walls pressing in, air thin as paper, lungs burning even through the mask. Then someone saw them. High, above, contrails. Words came slowly, squeezed between breaths. White strokes across the sky, not the delicate wisps of piston fighters, but long, hard chalk lines, drawn by gods with steady hands. They stretched straight and level, unbroken by wind, like railroad tracks, across the firmament. The B-29s. They did not climb, they did not turn, they did not seem to notice the fighters clawing upward far below. They simply moved, slow and inevitable, like a winter storm front, vast and uncaring. Their engines hummed, not roaring but murmuring with the calm arrogance of power that did not need to boast. A Raiden reached 29,000 feet and stalled, nose dropping, wings rocking in humiliation. The pilot cursed gravity, the engine, the foreign machines above, but most bitterly. He cursed the air itself. He jammed the throttle. The Mitsubishi engine wheezed. The air at that height was not air, but an enemy invisible, freezing, cruel. Through his goggles, frost rhyming the edges, a Tojo pilot watched tracer fire arc upward not to strike, but to fall away in graceful defeat, sparks dying in blue air. The gunners aboard the American giants did not bother to return fire. The distance between predator and prey was too great, too absurd. A voice on the radio, thin and distant as if spoken from a shrine. "They are above 30,000. Silence answered. There was no tactic for that. No bravery, no Bushido lecture from academy days, no engine chant from the maintenance crews could add horsepower or steal oxygen from the sky. one Raiden pilot tried anyway. He pulled his nose high, felt the controls stiffen, saw the speed bleed. His engine hiccuped a gasp, a metallic cough, and for a heartbeat he believed he had succeeded. The altitude needle quivered just past 29,000. Victory, by inches. Then the world spun. Stars, earth, wingtip, sky. A violent tumble. His vision tunneled. The oxygen mask clamped his face like an icy vice. He breathed, but the breath felt empty, hollow. The mask hissed. The altimeter unwound. The earth waited below. He recovered barely at 17,000, teeth clenched so hard he tasted blood. In his headset came a sound he did not expect. Distant. Laughter. Not mocking, but breathless. A man who has just seen a mountain and discovered it is taller than myth allowed. A flight leader spoke, voice steady not from courage but from recognition of truth. Return to base. Record altitude. We will report. The B-29s continued westward, contrails stretching behind them like white spears. No Japanese fighter reached firing position. No bomber turned. No gunner flinched. Back on the ground, pilots climbed out slowly, legs shaking not from G-forces but from exhaustion, from the strange, humiliating awe of watching an enemy occupy a domain denied by physics and fuel and fate. Engineers unscrewed frozen cowling bolts, muttering that they needed better superchargers, better fuel, better oxygen seals. Commanders scribbled altitude figures that looked like mistakes. A young sergeant pilot, 19 years old, cheeks chapped, eyes red-rimmed, stared at the empty sky and whispered, "If they can fly where we cannot follow, how do we stop them?" No one answered. Far above, beyond prayer and reach, the American bombers vanished into high cloud, as serene and untouchable as silver temples drifting in heaven. For the first time in the war over Japan, a thought fluttered through the ready rooms like a winter draft. The enemy has found a way to fight in the sky itself, a sky we cannot breathe. And in a snowy hangar on Kyūshū, a maintenance chief, sleeves rolled past scar-red forearms, spat black oil into the dirt and muttered what many already knew. This war has climbed beyond us. Kyūshū, October to November, 1944. The reports from Ashiya and Itazuke reached headquarters in Tokyo, stacked like battlefield casualty forms, crisp, factual, quietly devastating. The numbers were unbelievable, not because they were inaccurate, but because they shattered the imagined balance between sky and machine. American bombers cruising at 31 to 33,000 feet, Japanese, interceptors gasping at 28,000. The sky above that, once a poet's realm, had become a battlefield Japan could not enter. In staff rooms thick with tobacco smoke and the scratch of fountain pens, officers circled altitudes on plotting charts, tapping them with calloused fingers, as if tapping could pull down the enemy. A colonel at Army Air Headquarters looked at a chart of engine performance curves and murmured, "They live where our engines die." Mechanics in Kyūshū did not need charts. They had oil-stained rags and tools worn smooth by desperation. They looked at spark plugs glazed white, piston rings scored by detonation, supercharger impellers that pitted like frost-bitten flesh. They had always known the Nakajima and Mitsubishi radials were loyal beasts, rugged, loyal, temperamental. But now they faced a different enemy, thin air and physics. At Itazuke's windswept flight line, ground crews wrestled with oxygen lines, calibrating regulators that hissed, like wounded snakes. Supercharger ducting, once an afterthought for coastal defense missions, became sacred metal. Mechanics pulled intake screens with trembling hands, seeking anything dust, grit, divine flaw to explain failure. No flaw was needed. Japan had asked too much from engines built for a different war, a war of mid-altitude duels, of intercepting B-25s and B-24s, not giants forged to live in the stratosphere. The Ki-44 Tojo could claw upward with ferocity short wings, big engine, temper like a street dog in Osaka, but it flamed out where the air thinned. The J-2M Raiden, proud defender of the homeland, could surge briefly past 29,000 feet, only to pant like a runner collapsing yards from the tape. pilots felt the humiliation most. In the ready room at Ashiya, young aviators ran gloved fingers along chalkboard altitude markings, 27,000, 29,000, and then, above, a chalk line, so high it nearly brushed the timber ceiling, 32,000. Someone had drawn clouds around it in mocking silence. A lieutenant, barely 20, whispered, "They fly like gods." His instructor, a veteran of China, struck the board with a bamboo pointer. "Men built them, men can kill them." His voice cracked on the word kill, the bamboo splintering in his hand. That afternoon, new orders arrived. Increase climb discipline. Reduce climb angle above 25,000 feet. Conserve boost pressure. Intercept from ahead, not below. As if discipline could conjure horsepower. The B-29 appeared again 3 days later, engines shimmering in thin sunlight. They came in smaller formations this time, probing weather routes, testing radar stations, mapping flak belts. Their contrails stretched across Kyūshū like chalk scars against heaven. The scramble warning sounded. Pilots sprinted, mechanics prayed, engines coughed awake. A Raiden from the 302nd. Kokutai reached 28,500 feet before its pilot's vision tunneled, black creeping inward like ink-soaking paper. He fumbled the oxygen control. Ice crackled in the hoses. He looked up just long enough to see the silver belly of a B-29 flash in sunlight, serene, untouchable before he fell away, his machine shuddering. A Tojo managed to close within 600 meters, close enough to see gun ports, close enough to dream of firing, and then the American guns flickered. Not frantic bursts, calm, measured streams. 2 seconds, a drumbeat of light. The Japanese fighter fluttered like a paper lantern caught in a storm and fell, trailing a thread of black smoke. He did not even radio. The sky stole breath and voice together. Afterward, the squadron commander at Ashiya wrote a line that later historians would highlight. They are not merely higher, they are beyond. Beyond range, beyond ceiling, beyond doctrine. Back at the base, mechanics. Shut down engines still ticking with heat. Crew chiefs stared at boost regulators as though blame could be found in screws and metal instead of metallurgy and fate. A senior sergeant, grey at the temples, muttered a farmer's curse at the heavens and kicked a toolbox, scattering wrenches across concrete like thrown dice. Inside a canvas tent that served as a briefing room, pilots sat with steaming metal cups in their hands. They did not drink. They needed the warmth more than the taste. Their flight leader stood by a battered map and spoke softly. "We cannot climb to kill them. We must think differently. We must turn the sky sideways." He pointed to routes, to head-on passes, to ambush angles, to tactics born from desperation and intellect, not altitude. They all nodded, but each man felt the same truth grinding inside like grit. The air now belonged to the ones who could breathe thinner sky. Far above, unseen by those below, a B-29 gunner scribbled in his mission log. "Saw single enemy fighter, could not reach us, like watching a fish try to leap a waterfall." He was wrong in metaphor. It was not water the Japanese pilots tried to climb, but the very edge of Earth's breath. Yet he captured the cruelty of it. By mid-November, whispers crept through every squadron on Kyūshū. The Americans have brought a bomber that cannot be followed. And so a quiet dread settled across airfields dusted with frost and hope. Japan could build brave pilots. It could forge loyal engines. But it could not lift breath where breath did not live. The sky at 31,000 feet was no longer sky, it was a border. A ceiling not of altitude, but of destiny. Kyūshū, late autumn, 1944. The humiliation did not sit quietly in Japanese hearts. It burned like frostbite, numb at first, then agonizing. The first daylight encounters with the Superfortress had not simply shown a new enemy. They had redrawn the battlefield vertically. A war, once, fought across islands and sea lanes now stretched into thin, bitter air where lungs faltered and machines prayed. At Ashiya airfield, dawn came steel and pale, the wind carrying salt from Hakata Bay. Pilots shivered, not from cold alone, but from anticipation sharpened into ritual. Flight boots thudded across frost-rimmed planks. Maintenance crews warmed engines with canvas coats and kerosene lamps, coaxing heat into metal as priests might coax spirit into ritual steel. A siren cut across the ramp. Raid! Altitude 3 to 2,000, bearing south-southeast. Maps fluttered. Coffee bowls were abandoned half full. No one ran clumsily. They moved with the practiced violence of men who knew every second mattered, and every second might still not be enough. Ki-44 Tojos lit first sharp-nosed, narrow-winged, engines coughing into roar. Their short, muscular fuselages quivered as throttle levers slammed forward. J-2M Raidens followed heavier, their Mitsubishi, 18-cylinder engines, snarling like chained tigers denied meat. The first plane lifted off, wingtips skating on air, wheels tucking as if embarrassed to be still earthbound. The climb began. Not a chase, a choreography of futility. At 10,000 feet, engines sang willingly. At 15,000, voices strained. At 22,000, the machines began to confess truth. They were not meant to live here. Gauges quivered, boost needles trembled against red lines. Pilots felt their breath grow shallow, masks cold and metallic against cheeks. The world narrowed sky, needles, engine sound, heartbeat. At 27,000 feet, one pilot radioed, voice thin as winter reeds. Pressure, falling, oxygen irregular. His wingman tried to respond. Static and breath answered. Frost gathered along the canopy beams, delicate, mocking lace. A glove tapped the fuel pressure gauge, a ritual gesture of disbelief, as if a finger could will courage into metal. Then the B-29s arrived. No roar, no effort. They simply appeared distant, massive, impossibly serene. Silver wings etched contrails like calligraphy across the heavens. There was no urgency in them, no strain. They did not claw sky. They wore it. A Raiden pilot eased the stick forward, inching toward firing range. His voice, cracking, reached ground control. I see them. They look calm. He fired a burst short, hopeful. Tracers arced and died, the rounds falling away as though gravity itself refused to aid desperation. The American gunners saw movement, turned their turrets, and sent thin, purposeful lines of .50 caliber fire downward. The sound inside Japanese cockpits was muted like hail tapping on a shrine roof far away, but the effect was not. A wing root shuddered. Metal peeled like paper, kissed by flame. A Tojo dropped from formation, nose-dipping, spiraling down in graceful, deadly poetry. Another pilot saw it and did not curse. He whispered instead, reverent and bitter, "We chase shadows." They tried new tactics. They attacked from ahead, noses pointed not upward but forward, claws reaching not for altitude but for timing. The fighters burst through thin air like arrows loosed from a bow too weak to kill. A Tojo crossed the Americans' path at 90 degrees, guns blazing in a head-on fury. The B-29's nose turret spoke. The fighter became a spark, then nothing, a shred of aluminum tumbling like confetti through icy air. Ground crews waited below, counting minutes, counting hopes. A mechanic smoked a cigarette down to the filter in one drag, fists buried in pockets to hide shaking hands. One after another the fighters returned, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. Landing gear lowered stiffly. Tires kissed earth with the relief of drowning men finding sand. Engines coughed, seized, cooled. Canopies opened, and pilots crawled out not like warriors but like mountaineers staggering from a failed summit bid. Captain Nakano, flight leader of the day's scramble, pulled off his oxygen mask with trembling fingers. Frost clung to his eyebrows. His lips were pale, almost blue. A crew chief ran to support him, but he pushed away. "I saw them smile," he murmured. "Who, sir?" "The Americans. They weren't fighting us. They were commuting." The word struck the ground crew harder than any bullet. Commuting. As if the world above 29,000 feet belonged to another civilization. Engineers gathered later in a drafty hangar, chalk dust floating in lamplight. They traced compressor curves and fuel mixture ratios on a blackboard. Single-stage superchargers, they admitted, were loyal workhorses, but in the stratosphere they were donkeys sent to pull chariots. One engineer whispered, "Their turbines eat the sky, ours choke on it." Someone suggested ramming tactics kamikaze, but in the purest sky. Men nodded slowly, not in zeal but in resignation. When steel cannot reach, in heaven, flesh is offered instead. That night, frost spread across runway and wing route alike. A sentry on patrol watched stars burn white above. He looked at those tiny fires and wondered how the Americans had learned to live closer to them. The B-29 was not merely an airplane now, it was prophecy, a giant born of aluminum and pressure domes, of 4 supercharged engines and a nation's industrial gospel, of octane numbers Japan could not dream of assembly lines and endless fuel and engineers who shaped turbines like priests shaping relics. Japan's pilots had climbed as high as lungs, metal, and courage allowed, and they had found a ceiling made not of sky, but of empire, a ceiling built of industry, gasoline, math, and time. Above that ceiling, the war was already lost. Below it, they still fought because fighters fight, even when the climb goes nowhere. Kyūshū. Early winter, 1944. Cold came early that year. Not the quiet cold of mountain mornings, but the brittle kind air that cracked in the lungs and froze oil in weapons before dawn. Frost rimmed the wings at Ashiya before the first mechanic stirred. Men huddled around engine preheaters, breath showing not because they exhaled, but because the sky wished to keep everything for itself. With the cold came resolve and a new doctrine. The orders arrived in stamped paper envelopes, charcoal ink still smelling faintly of the Tokyo print shop. They were read aloud in ready rooms whose walls were thin enough for the wind to participate. When altitude cannot be gained and fire cannot be brought to bear, you will deny the enemy victory by ramming. Shinten Seiku Tai Heaven shaking air superiority units. No one cheered. There was no speech, no cry of banzai. Pilots simply bowed. They were not fools. They knew the difference between strategy and sacrifice. They also knew the arithmetic of altitude had become the arithmetic of despair. When guns freeze, when oxygen thins, when engines gasp and instruments shudder, what remains is, will that most fragile, most dangerous fuel. One lieutenant folded the order and tucked it inside his flight suit, close enough to feel against his ribs. He murmured, "If we cannot rise to them, then we will meet them falling." At first light, the sirens sang again. Raid, altitude 3 to 2000, course north. Raidens and Tojos leapt skyward, wheels lifting through frost. The first attack came not from below but ahead, a head-on pass timed like a gambler throwing his last coin. A Tojo pilot sighted the silver shapes, advanced throttle until the engine shook like a drum skin, and held course. His oxygen mask iced, his teeth chattered in rhythm with the prop's violent hymn. The Superfortress filled his windscreen, impossibly steady, 4 engines beating like the pulse of a machine god. He fired a 2-second burst. Tracers clawed upward, bright against endless sky. They stitched nothing. The B-29 returned fire. The nose turret's long stream glinted in pale morning light. The Japanese fighter shuddered, struck through the oil cooler. The pilot inhaled once, deeply. Then he did not jink, did not evade. He stayed on course. 2 machines became 2 meteors, a black dot swallowed by a silver titan. Ground spotters saw nothing but a flash. In the logbook that evening, the duty officer wrote with shaking brush, "Heaven received another." The others did not flinch. On the next raid, a Raiden pilot reached 29,000 feet. He tried to climb further, but the engine coughed like an old samurai tasting blood. He trimmed nose up anyway, forcing metal into defiance. Fuel mixture leaned, spark plugs sparked erratically. Frost crept across his canopy. Still, he continued, breath shallow. He never fired. He simply turned his aircraft into a spear. The B-29's tail gunner, a boy from Kansas who used to mend fences and listen to farmhouse radios, saw the J-2M glint in the sun. His gloved hands tightened on the charging handles. His heart pounded air thin as paper. He fired a burst, another. The Japanese fighter staggered. Then, as if insulted by bullets, it surged again. At 200 yards, the tail gunner screamed into his mask. It was not fear, the later debrief noted it was disbelief. Impact came like a closing door. The Raidens sliced under the tailplane, shearing metal like stalks of rice. The bomber shuddered, lurched, fell into a shallow, doomed dive. Parachutes blossomed like winter flowers, drifting through air that no nation could claim. Both pilots were listed as missing. In two capitals, oceans apart, clerks dipped pens and wrote names in neat lines. Only family tears differed. Ramming was not the only tactic. Some sought precision in the madness. Captain Maeda, a former student of aeronautics, believed he could turn desperation into method. He briefed his flight. Strike engines, wings. Structure, not the cockpit. We fight machines, not souls. They nodded. On their sortie, they attacked head-on, peeling upward at the last instant to fire into engines where propellers gleamed like spinning suns. One Ki-44 found its mark. 50 caliber fire raked it, tearing skin and rib, yet its burst hit an outboard engine. Fire blossomed. A B-29 peeled from formation, a wounded bird spiraling downward. The pilot bailed out near Kagoshima Bay and later wrote in his diary, "They came not like fanatics but like craftsmen. They aimed, they chose." Maeda's men returned fewer than left. But they returned. They bowed to ground crew, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement of another dawn survived. Engineers did not stand idle. They polished supercharger impellers until reflections shone like polished mirrors. They begged for American-quality fuel 130 octane, dreamed of like treasure. They filed oxygen lines, thawed regulators, heated gun belts in charcoal heaters to prevent freezing. They fought physics with hands, sweat, and prayer. Yet still the B-29 climbed as if the sky welcomed it, while Japanese engines clawed and coughed as if the heavens were hostile. In mess tents, pilots spoke softly. "We do not fight men, we fight altitude. We fight time. We fight the air itself." Families in Kyūshū received telegrams. Some read them aloud under shrine lamps, others did not open them at all. Mothers burned incense, wives knelt. Children asked why father hadn't come home and were told he now flew where stars never froze. One pilot left a note that a squadron mate later found tucked in a boot locker. "Tell them I flew upward, not in anger, but in duty. If I could not reach the sky, perhaps my spirit could." On a night in early December, a mechanic finishing his shift looked up at the stars. He had grease under nails, frost in his beard, and the smell of avgas in his clothes. He whispered, into the wind, "They live above us. How do you shoot down the sky?" He received no answer, only the sound of wind on sheet metal and far-off surf. But somewhere above, the contrails of the day still drifted in moonlight, dissolving reminders that men had climbed as far as breath and courage allowed. Some had returned, some had not. And yet morning would come again, and once more the scramble bell would ring, not because victory waited, but because duty did. B-29, Combat Crew Perspective, Winter, 1944. Above Kyūshū, winter lived differently. At 31,000 feet, winter wasn't cold, it was a presence. A predator, an intelligence. Frost didn't form, it attacked. Oil didn't thicken, it resisted movement like a stubborn animal. Men didn't merely shiver, they felt their bones hum with air too thin to trust. Inside B-29, General H. Arnold Special, the sun was a white blade cutting through the canopy. The crew moved with the reggery, discipline of men who lived one valve, one switch, one breath from disaster. They did not shout, they did not waste words. Oxygen masks hissed quietly like the bomber itself was breathing for them. "Flight deck check," the aircraft commander said, voice muffled by rubber and canvas. "Engineer steady, turbos normal, oil temp green, navigator on course, drift 3 degrees right." Gunnery. The central fire control gunner grinned, though no one could see it. Guns warm, sights cleared. God help anyone dumb enough to come up here. Humor was armor. They needed armor. At -40 degrees, metal and flesh had the same brittle nature. Touch the wrong panel with bare skin and it fused. Blink too long and frost would try to seal your lashes. Sweat froze inside flight suits. Tears turned to ice before grief could form. And still they preferred this sky. Here, altitude was ally. The air itself did half the fighting. Contact low, 2 o'clock. Single. Bandit. Climbing hard. The right blister gunner, a kid from Nebraska with hands built for milking cows, squinted through optics. A tiny dot surged upward in the shimmering cold. It wobbled slightly, as if the pilot fought not with the bomber, but with gravity itself. "Looks like a Tojo," he muttered. "How high?" the aircraft commander asked. "Poor devil's at maybe 28,000. He's drowning." They watched. The Japanese fighter clawed upward, engine white smoking from cold and strain. It reached a point where air betrayed it, where control surfaces no longer obeyed, where oxygen betrayed blood, where hope thinned like atmosphere. The fighter stalled. The right blister gunner exhaled slowly. He did not feel triumph. He felt pity he was not supposed to feel. "Hold fire," the aircraft commander said quietly. "Let him go." The fighter fell backward, flipped, caught itself, dove weakly for thicker air. No one spoke for a moment. The bomber droned on. But pity had limits, and war was still war. Minutes later, bandits, multiple, coming in, high, left, good angle. This time the enemy had timed the climb. 2 Raidens approached in staggered bursts of energy, using every trick pilots had learned against impossibility. They closed fast, very fast. The lead Raiden flashed silver-green in the sun, cannon ports glinting like predatory eyes. Stand by, guns hummed alive. In the B-29, firing wasn't a staccato rattle. It was a chorus, electric motors feeding belts, gyroscopic sights adjusting, centralized fire control whispering angles, and lead corrections through wires and gears. The upper turret sang first a 3-second burst, tracers stitched in a graceful arc, glowing beads on a wire of death. The Raiden jerked sideways, a wingtip shredding, aileron flailing like torn cloth. Then the tail turret joined deep vibrating thunder through the fuselage. The second fighter spasmed, flame licking from cowl seams. "Brakes good, they're falling through." "We got lucky." Luck wasn't the right word, they all knew it. Altitude was the real gunner. The bombardier, warmest man aboard in his heated seat, watched the fighters drop back down. He swallowed once. He had trained to destroy factories, cities, rail yards. Never expected to feel his heart clench over one falling airplane shaped like a bird that had forgotten how to fly. He spoke softly into the intercom. "They're brave." Silence followed. Courage respected courage even here, in air so thin angels might fear to breathe it. The tail gunner finally replied. "Brave doesn't beat physics." Life aboard was numbers and ritual, fuel leaning, turbine temperatures, pressure domes and turbos singing steel hymns. Men stayed alive by mathematics, 100% oxygen, pressurization monitors, heated gloves checked every 13 minutes, machine gun heaters to keep actions from freezing. Below, whole towns prayed to gods and emperors. Up here, survival depended on checking the mixture, firing heaters, trusting gauges. Faith was metal, faith was gasoline, faith was engineering. And still they carried letters tucked under flight suits, photographs of wives, sweethearts, new babies. One gunner rubbed his pocket between volleys, whispering to a future he refused to let this sky deny him. Near the end of the run, the radar operator spotted one more signal, a single fighter, climbing alone. Slow, determined, the commander frowned. He's not even trying to set a lead angle. He's coming straight. The radio operator cleared his throat. "Ramming attack?" Nobody joked now. The turrets aligned. A finger hovered over a firing switch, and yet the fighter never reached them. At 29,000 feet, his engine sputtered, froze, and the aircraft dipped, straightened, dipped again. He rolled gracefully, as though bowing, then disappeared below the bomber's belly like a comet losing faith in flight. God, someone whispered. Not a curse, a prayer? Warriors on both sides loved flight. Flight was betraying one side now. When the bomber finally banked for home, the crew felt exhaustion beyond muscle. They had not truly fought that day, not in the old way, where two aircraft tangled like wrestlers in sky. They had endured. They had witnessed. Altitude had chosen sides. The radio operator logged the sortie. In the margin he scribbled, "Those pilots fight the air more than us. We meet courage every mission. Up here, mercy feels heavy." In the briefing hut afterward, officers discussed tactics, gun jams, oxygen checks. Young gunners drank scalding coffee with shaking hands, pretending it was cold that made them tremble. No one talked about the Japanese fighter that struggled until the sky rejected him like a cruel judge. But every man remembered. Altitude made victors, altitude made ghosts, and sometimes altitude made mourners. Japan Air Defense Command, winter into early spring, 1945. War rooms are quiet spaces in photographs, maps, compasses, officers bending over charts. But in reality, there is a particular sound, the sound of math being confronted like an enemy, chalk on slate, papers sliding, the click of an abacus. The sigh that comes when courage meets arithmetic and knows arithmetic does not blink. In late winter of 1945, at the Army Air Defense Command in Tokyo, that sound dominated. A colonel of engineering background stood before a blackboard streaked white with formulas. His uniform was neat, his face was tired. Behind him, rail-thin staff officers sat at desks, their shoulders hunched as though poor posture might hide bad news. On the board were 3 columns: altitude, fuel, power. He tapped the board with a chalk nub. Facts do not surrender because we wish them to. No one argued. The first column, altitude. B-29, ceiling beyond 33,000 feet, combat crews above 31,000, pressurized, heated guns, crew breathing filtered life. Japanese fighters, Key 44 29,000 feet strained, J2M slightly higher, but delicate, temperamental at height. Key 43 and 0 lower still, stars they once chased now cold and unreachable. The colonel underlined the numbers, each stroke a soft gunshot. The second column, fuel. American fuel, 130 to 150 octane. Japanese fuel, nominally 87 octane, often less in practice, sometimes corrupted by humidity, by storage, by desperation. High octane did more than burn. It allowed compression, turbo boost, altitude itself. One captain murmured, barely audible, "Their gasoline is worth more than our planes." No one laughed. It was not wit. It was an obituary. The third column, power. American engines. Pratt & Whitney R2800 Wright. R3350 radials, built like steel temples, fed by turbo superchargers the size of temple bells, spinning with the fury of modern industry. Japanese engines. Nakajima Ha-21. Mitsubishi Kasei. Good engines. Brave engines. But unboosted in the way the new war demanded. Built for altitudes where oxygen still remembered men. The colonel circled the final figure. Horsepower at 30,000 feet. Americans. Near war-rated power. Japan. Half. Sometimes less. Sometimes engines simply refused, like hearts too tired to climb another stair. "We fight pilots," the colonel said softly, "but they fight with factories." A silence followed. The war was suddenly not about wings and will, but furnaces and fuel pumps, chemistry and metallurgy. A major cleared his throat. "Then we must build equal machines." A lieutenant, one eye red from frost burns received in the cockpit, spoke without looking up. "We do not have time to build altitude." While officers studied charts, pilots lived them. At Omura Airfield, ground crews rubbed numb hands together, working to bring a J2M's engine to life. Kerosene heaters snarled. Mechanics wrapped bullet belts in blankets. They treated oxygen valves like prayer beads, twisting them gently, reverently. One mechanic, 19 years old and already world-weary, muttered, "The air hates us." His chief shook his head. "No, the war has gone somewhere we cannot reach." Nearby, a N1K2J Shidenkai sat gleaming, wings folded like a hawk at rest. A magnificent machine at low and mid-altitudes, agile and dangerous. But today, a monk placed in the wrong temple, pilots strapped in, masks secure, eyes hard. They knew the plan. Climb as far as blessed engine and cursed gravity permitted. Strike head-on if possible. If not, attack from sides, from where B-29 gunners saw least. If all else failed, but no one finished the thought, take off, wheels lifted, land fell away, sky grew thin, fingers tingled, breath labored, frost scratched across canopies like claw marks. They reached 27,000, 28, wills strong, pistons weary. Above, contrails already marked the heavens like chalk lines of sovereignty. A Raiden pilot whispered into his mask, "We are students taking an exam in a subject we have never studied." He pushed throttle. Engine coughed. Fuel mixture protested. The B-29 formation floated above, serene, mathematical, inevitable. In Tokyo, a university professor, now serving as military advisor, sat alone that night and wrote in his diary, "We taught our boys to duel swords at dawn. The Americans built a ladder to the moon. Our courage is ancient. Their war is industrial." He paused, then wrote another line, shaking, "I begin to believe altitude is a weapon." Reports came in. The Americans bombed not from desperation but calculation. High-altitude precision, low-altitude firestorms later, always choosing, always with options. Japanese fighters did not operate with options. They operated with obligation. The turning point was not a battle, it was a realization. A senior officer stood in the war room, fingers resting on the edge of the table. "We cannot outfly them," he said. "We cannot outclimb them. We must outbleed them." A younger officer, exhausted, pale, grieving friends, replied, "Sir, they do not bleed at altitude." No one rebutted him. When the others left, the colonel remained staring at the board. He wiped one line slowly, chalk dust falling like ash. Altitude, 33,000. He rewrote it, heavier, 33,000 feet. Beneath it he wrote, "Honor cannot ignite a supercharger." He closed the log, extinguished the lamp, and whispered to the darkness, "Bravery is infinite. Oxygen is not." Below is the continuation, Chapter 7, to 900 words. Same tone, pacing, historical rigor. There are moments in war when the enemy changes shape not because he must, but because he chooses to. And that choice, that freedom, is the most devastating weapon of all. In early spring of 1945, Japan learned what it means when a sky giant decides gravity no longer applies to strategy. The B-29, once a high-altitude phantom beyond bullets and breath, did something astonishing. It came down. General Curtis LeMay issued orders from the Marianas with the same calm an engineer uses to flip a switch on a test bench. Strip guns, strip armor, fill bays with incendiaries, fly low, hit the cities when the night has no wind. Altitude had been the fortress. Altitude had been invincibility. Now altitude was optional. At first, Japanese radar screens lit with disbelief. Plotters marked altitude estimates twice, 3 times. 10,000 feet? Impossible check calibration. 5,000? Searchlights report 1,500 feet. The sky that once belonged solely to contrails now roared with engines at treetop height. B-29s skimmed rivers, coastlines, rooftops, shadows with wings. A night observer at Chiba saw one pass and whispered to no one. Japan's home defense fighters scrambled. Key 100. Key 84. Aircraft finally capable of altitude and speed. Smart designs, brave mechanics. Pilots who had learned through grief what no academy taught. But engines needed fuel, and fuel was myth. At Komaki Airfield, pilots strapped in at dusk. Mechanics whispered quiet apologies to their machines, knowing they were feeding them low-grade fuel that burned like sorrow. One key, 84, started, coughed, stopped. Another sputtered. A third backfired so hard the cowling rattled like a shaken shrine bell. The squadron leader cursed softly, not at men or machines, but at fate. He had studied the B-29's high-altitude tactics, plotted intercept climbs, practiced diving gunnery in winter skies so thin they sliced lungs. Now the giants flew, low enough for pistols, for prayer, for hatred, and he sat on a runway with empty tanks and hope worn thin like cloth turned threadbare at elbows. He lifted once, underpowered and overburdened with duty. He glimpsed the bombers' glowing city beneath them like molten sunrise, Tokyo burning in a sea of orange embers, and his voice cracked in the radio. He did not make contact. He barely made it back to Earth. Tokyo burned first, then Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe. The flames were not battles, they were harvests. The wind carried the sound of a nation cracking. Civilians watched the bombers with naked awe. Not hatred, awe. The aircraft flew steady, low enough that people saw the silhouettes of gunners at blister windows. Some swore they could see faces. An elderly man in Tokyo, a poet before ration paper became too precious, later wrote, "They flew like carp over a pond, gliding in silence above the roar." I thought, this is how the future visits the past, not as warrior, but as furnace. For the first time, B-29 crews looked down and saw not flak bursts but lanterns, rooftops, people waving fists or hands or white cloth, and fires that rolled across wards like tidal surf. Bombardiers who once toggled precise drops over factories now opened bays over wooden homes. And some found their hands trembling more doing so than when tracer fire arced upward. A gunner, 19, Iowa farm boy, wrote in his log, "At altitude, they looked small. Down here I see them tiny figures running. It's war, I know. But God help us all." Altitude had made both sides abstract. High war is clean in imagination. Thin air strips faces from foes, turns fighters to silhouettes and bombers to mathematics. But once the giants descended, faces returned in cockpits, in streets, in gun sights and in memory. Japanese pilots could now reach the intruders technically. A Ki-84 once clawed into formation near Hamamatsu, firing 2 short bursts before fuel pressure faltered. The American gunner who fired back saw the pilot slump, not from bullets, but exhaustion. When the Japanese fighter spiraled down, the bomber crew was silent. Did we hit him? No, the sky beat him. Same as before, only closer. In rural fields, villagers lay awake and counted engines in the night, 4-engine drone, then hundreds. Children learned to identify altitude by sound, like monks telling time by bells. In the Imperial Palace bunker, maps glowed under weak lamps as staff officers traced the march of fire. They no longer discussed intercept altitudes. They discussed water supply, rice storage, surrender. War had tilted not at Midway, not at Leyte, but at 33,000 feet when it became clear one nation could live in the sky and the other could only visit. Altitude had been prophecy. Now low altitude was verdict. When the B-29 descended to where zero pilots once reigned, the zero was gone. When the bomber altitudes dipped into reach, Japan's fuel tanks were dry. When gun range finally overlapped, ammunition depots were shells. The sky had lowered, but Japan's strength had fallen faster. And somewhere in Kyūshū, an aging Raiden pilot with frost-scarred cheeks stepped from his tent, looked up at a bomber flying at treetop height, and whispered, "You mocked us from heaven. Now you walk in our field, and still we cannot touch you." He removed his cap and bowed not in surrender, but in recognition. Altitude had been a kingdom. Fire at low level was coronation. The air war was no longer contest, it was conclusion. He breathed deeply, felt night air fill lungs that once tried to breathe at 30,000 feet, and murmured, "Even gods must descend to finish a war." Below is Chapter 8, The Last Climb. 900 words, same tone, rhythm, factual accuracy, numbers spelled out. It was a quiet morning on Kyūshū when the final climb began, not in triumph, not even in defiance, but in the fragile stubbornness of men who refused to let the sky close over them without one last effort. By mid-1945, the airfields at Kanoya, Ashiya, and Itazuke no longer hummed with readiness. They whispered. Grass clung to runway edges. Fuel drums sat light as drums in a ghost band half full of water, quarter full of hope. Mechanics walked like monks among grounded aircraft, touching cowling seams as though touching gravestones. The fuel logs told the truth before any general did. Daily operational strength: key 84 available, 5 key 100 available, 3 flyable today, sometimes 2 fuel allotment per aircraft. Whatever can be siphoned. The B-29s came regardless, not as visitors anymore, but as residents of the air. They arrived in daylight now, because there was no need to hide. Their contrails were not threads, they were signatures, and below, Japanese warning stations reported altitude, without urgency. No scramble order, no frantic radio calls, only the hum of defeat. Yet there were still pilots' men who had once believed altitude was a ladder one climbed by will alone. And one of them, Captain Masao Harada of the 99th Sentai, refused to let the final story end on the ground. He was 23. He had lost classmates over China, brothers over the Philippines, tears somewhere over Formosa. His oxygen mask smelled of rubber and memory. His Key 84 Hayate sat fueled with the dregs of every can on the field, 70 litres from an instructor trainer, 30 from a stored Key 43, another 40 scrounged from the emergency generator drums. Enough for one climb, not enough for return. No one told him to fly. No one could have stopped him. His crew chief did not salute. He bowed instead a bow more intimate than military courtesy, a bow of shared exhaustion, shared loyalty, and shared impending loss. Bring back the wind, the mechanic murmured, old pilot saying, meaning bring back proof the sky still cares about us. Harada strapped in. The canopy closed with the soft finality of a casket lid. Takeoff was always violent in a Hayate. The engine snarled like something alive, something that resented gravity but respected courage. The landing gear tucked in with a shudder. The field shrank. Then the island. Then Japan herself, a green shape in mist. He climbed, 5,000 feet, 10,000, 15,000, where once 0 pilots had danced. At 20,000 feet, the engine coughed a tired cough, the sound of a heavy smoker on winter dawn. Harada adjusted mixture, trim, prop pitch. He whispered encouragement to the machine, not superstition, but camaraderie. These two had flown together before. They knew each other's limits. 24,000 feet, 26. 27, the red line he had once respected. He pushed. The aircraft trembled. Not from buffeting, but from fatigue, metal that had grown old in a single season. Rivets whispered. Oil pressure dipped, returned, dipped again. Frost began forming on the canopy frame. At 29,000 feet, he saw them. B-29s. A formation. White trails stretched behind them like banners proclaiming a new era. They flew not hard, not straining, not triumphant or desperate, simply inevitable. He levelled. His altimeter needle shook. His engine ran with a note that sounded like prayer and death intertwined. There was no angle left to climb into firing position. No speed reserve to close distance. His guns remained silent, not from lack of will, but lack of reach. He was in the enemy's sky, yet still beneath it. A B-29 gunner saw him. Two machines, separated by technology and circumstance, regarded each other across 200 yards, and a century of industrial difference. No shots fired, none needed. A Japanese fighter, in 1942, was symbol of an empire rising. A Japanese fighter in 1945 was symbol of a nation staying upright on pride long after strength was gone. Harada saluted. The American gunner lifted a gloved hand in reply. Two men, both exhausted, both too young for the history crushing them, shared the smallest courtesy that war sometimes allows. Then fuel said its final word. The Hayate shuddered. The engine hiccuped twice, as if clearing its throat for a last speech, then died. The prop windmilled. Silence took the cockpit. Harada exhaled. He could bail out, land in sea, drift toward capture or drowning. He chose a glide instead, gentle, controlled, like a man leaving a room by closing the door softly, not slamming it. In the distance, smoke rose from cities no longer defended by altitude, fire, or dream. His aircraft slipped beneath cloud, beneath hope, beneath history. A fisherman near Kagoshima later reported a plane landing in shallow surf, wheels up. He saw a pilot climb out, kneel in water up to waist, and press forehead to cockpit skin, as if thanking an exhausted horse. When villagers reached him, he was alive, silent, hollow, and honorable. In American intelligence summaries that month, one line appeared repeatedly: enemy air resistance negligible. In Japanese unit rosters, names vanished like morning mist. The last climb had not been about victory. It had been about refusing to surrender altitude in the soul, even when physics and fuel dictated reality. As the B-29s droned eastward, their contrails smeared by upper winds, Harada looked up once more. His mechanic's words echoed. He had. Not a tactical success. Not a kill. Not even a touch, but proof thin as air at 30,000 feet that there were men who climbed even when the sky had already chosen who owned it. In that final climb, Japan's fighter spirit did not break. It simply ran out of altitude.